Hilchos Maaseh Hakorbanos Perek Arba Asar, the laws of sacrificial procedures, chapter 14. This chapter really marks a segue into a new section of these laws, where we're kind of done with the actual procedure related to each individual type of sacrifice. Now that Rambam is going to talk about the general concept that a person can voluntarily commit to bring different animals or different objects as sacrifices, and how exactly we go about determining what is considered to be a voluntary offering and the laws that apply to voluntary offerings. That's really going to take us to the next couple of days, dealing with these concepts of neder and nedava. Neder and nedava are two Hebrew words that basically mean the same thing, a voluntary commitment to bring something as a sacrifice. The difference is in the wording, how they're formulated. When you say neder, and we'll actually discuss this in this chapter, but I'll just give it to you as a preface. Neder is where the person takes the obligation upon himself. He says, Harei alai, I take it upon myself to bring X, Y, and Z. Nedava is where you put the obligation on the object. This is consecrated towards X, Y, and Z, and we'll see some differences between the two, some ramifications in today's chapter. The Rambam begins, Halacha Aleph, Misnadev Adam v'noider. A person can do either type of voluntary donation, Nedava or the Neder, of an oila or a shlamim. A person can voluntarily commit to bring a burnt offering or a peace offering. V'chol min sheyirtze mechamisha mini menachos habayin b'neder nedava, and any of the 5 types of flour offerings that can be brought voluntarily. 2 days ago we saw that Rambam gave us a chart, 3 communal offerings, 9 individual offerings of flour, and of those 9 individual flour offerings, 5 of them, 5 types, could be brought as a donation. And so anytime a person wants to bring a donation, his donation could consist of either, if it's an animal, burnt or peace offering, or any of the flour voluntary offerings. Additionally, umisnadev oinoider, a person can voluntarily commit to donate mincha miminchas nesachim levada, a flour offering as it accompanies libations, which accompanies animal sacrifices. Me'eza min mishleisha min minchas nesachim k'meshabiarnu, any of the types of the minchas that accompany another sacrifice as libations, as we explained. And additionally, umisnadev oinoider, a person can also voluntarily commit to donate yayin bifnei atzmai, just wine to go on the mizbeach, oy levayna bifnei atzma, or frankincense to go on the mizbeach, oy shemen bifnei atzmai, or oil on its own just to go on the mizbeach, oy eitzim lama'aracha, or a person can donate wood that will be added to the wood pile. Mipnei shehin kekarban, because wood is also considered to be like a sacrifice. Shanemar, as it says, ulekurban ha'etzim. This is in Nehemiah, when the Jews came back to build the second temple. The prophet records how the Jews donated different things. Some donated wood to be brought or to form the wood pile on the Mizbeach. The Rambam's exact position as to the nature of this wood sacrifice is open to big debate, because there's a great debate in general in the Talmud, in the early commentaries on the Talmud, as to what this sacrifice consisted of. Some understand it to be a sacrifice of wood. In other words, this is the wood pile. Somebody would bring a sacrifice of wood. The wood would be burnt on the wood pile as a separate sacrifice. And others understand that the wood would simply be added to the wood pile. It would be fuel for other sacrifices. And there's some question as to what the Rambam holds of it. Some of the major commentators on the Rambam, the Mishnah Lamelech, foremost among them, understands that the Rambam is alluding to wood that's brought as a sacrifice in and of itself. But the Rebbe has a long sikha, and we're not going to get into the details of it, but the bottom line of it is, the Rebbe understands the Rambam's position to be that when a person voluntarily brings wood on its own, it's, as the Rambam literally says here, eitzim lama'aracha. It's wood that contributes to the wood pile that serves as fuel for other sacrifices. That's the nature of this nidvas eitzim. Even though elsewhere in the Talmud we talk about a korban eitzim, a special wood offering that was brought by those families who would bring wood on certain days to the temple, as we saw in the beginning of this book. But as I explained to you then, and the Rebbe has interpretation of that Rambam as well, the Rambam's position over there on korban eitzim is not that the wood is a sacrifice, but that together with their wood donations, which were used for fuel in the wood pile, they would bring together with that sacrifices, burnt offerings. That was the korban ha'eitzim. But when a person is misnadev eitzim, it's eitzim lama'aracha. It's wood that was simply added to the wood pile. And again, we can get into the details of this, but that's the bottom line. You can see, look at the Sichos, volume 17, for the portion of Vayikra, That's where the sikha is there at length. Halacha beis, shnayim misnadvin oinoidrin karban echad. Two people can get together and voluntarily commit to donate one sacrifice. Oila ishlamim, again, burnt offering, peace offering. Afilu prida achas shal toida me'bneyayna mevi'in oisa b'shutfas. Even one of the birds in the pair of birds that were brought as a sacrifice, whenever you bring a bird sacrifice, you have to bring two. So one of the two can be brought in partnership. Aval hamincha ein haba b'shutfas, but not a flower offering. Flower offering cannot be brought in partnership. Udvarim elu hin divrei Kabbalah, and these are words received straight from tradition, Moses on Mount Sinai. By the way, there's a midrash which says clearly that also wood cannot be brought in partnership. And the Rambam doesn't bring that because of the same sikha that I mentioned before. That midrash follows the approach that the wood was actually brought as a sacrifice, and therefore it cannot be brought in partnership. But according to the Rambam, who understands that the wood was added as fuel, wood could be brought in partnership. Halacha gimel, hiniach mincha lishnei banav v'meis. If a person had a flower offering that he was planning to bring, and then he dies, and he leaves it to his two children, so they can bring it. It's not considered partnership because it belonged to their father, who was an individual person, and it's being brought on his behalf. Halacha dalid. Now that Rambam talks about what I mentioned before in the preface. Ezehu neder ve'ezehi nedava. We mentioned before voluntary commitments, voluntary donations. What is the halachic definition of a neder versus a nedava? Ha'omer, if somebody says, Harei olai oila, I take upon myself to bring a burnt offering, doesn't have an animal in front of him, he's thinking about the animal. I want to bring a burnt offering. Or Harei olai shlamim, or I take upon myself to bring a peace offering. Or Harei olai mincha, I take upon myself to bring a flower offering. Or Harei dmei behema zu olai, oila ishlamim, or the worth of this animal standing in front of me, I take upon myself to bring that worth as a burnt offering or a peace offering. Zeo haneder, in all these cases, since the commitment did not devolve on a specific object, it devolved on him, that's considered a neder. Aval ha'imr, but if somebody says, pointing to a specific animal, this animal, or the worth of this animal, he doesn't say upon me, just says the worth of this animal is a burnt offering or a peace offering, or this isarin, this tenth of the ephah of flour, is a flower offering, that's a nedava, because you've put it onto the actual object. What's the practical difference? What is the ramification as to the difference whether something is a neder or a nedava? If somebody made a neder, if he puts aside his sacrifice and then it got stolen or lost, he's obligated to replace it until he brings what he promised, because the obligation devolved on him. I promised to bring a burnt offering. Yeah, I put aside that cow, but now that cow is lost. Go bring a different cow. But a person who does an adava and therefore says the word this animal is holy, if it dies or is stolen, not obligated to replace it because that was the animal that was holy and it's gone now. If somebody says, this ox right over here, I take upon myself to give its worth as a burnt offering. Or this home, I take upon myself to give the money of this home as a sacrifice. And the ox dies, and the house falls down. They're of course not worth what they were worth when he made the promise. Chayav l'shalim, he's still obligated to pay its worth as it was to fulfill his promise. Amar, if a person says, I want to make a neder, I'm formulating my words as a neder, I take upon myself to bring a burnt offering, but I'm making that formulation on condition that I'm not going to be obligated to replace it if it gets lost. That's a good stipulation. You're not obligated to replace it if it gets lost. We already explained in the laws relating to when and where a Kohen is allowed to enter in the temple courtyard, in the temple structure. That if somebody constructs a home, a temple, outside the temple, and he wants to bring sacrifices there, that's not called idol worship, because you have God in mind. You want to bring sacrifices to God. Not allowed, but it's not considered idol worship. As I mentioned back then, it was what's called the mikdash chonyai, an unfortunate situation where there were two brothers that got into a fight over who should be the Kohen Gadol. One of them had to run away to Alexandria. We see here this is Israel. He ran away to Egypt, Alexandria, and he constructed what's called the mikdash of Chonyo. And according to some, there was actually sacrifices that were offered there at different times. Point is, this is an example of a house of God, made for God, not any idolatrous purpose, and therefore it didn't have the law of idolatry. Now, how does this relate to the topic at hand? So watch how these two places, the Holy Temple and this, we'll call the Mikdash Chanya, how they interplay. The Ha'omer, if somebody says, I take upon myself to bring a burnt offering, and I'm going to offer it in the holy temple, the authentic holy temple. So obviously, if he offers it in the Mikdash Chanya, that doesn't fulfill the obligation. It's not an idolatrous home, but it's not the holy temple, and you promise to bring it in the holy temple. But if a person makes a commitment, I take upon myself to bring a burnt offering, and I'm going to offer it in this home outside the temple that was dedicated to God. If he ends up bringing it in the proper, authentic holy temple, he's fulfilled his obligation, because his commitment was made to God with a godly purpose. It wasn't idolatrous. And also says the Rambam, if he ends up bringing it in the home for God outside the holy temple, he's fulfilled his promise. It's equivalent to promising to bring a burnt offering and not being obligated to replace it. If it gets lost, in this case, if it gets offered in a temple outside of the temple of Jerusalem, you're good. You're going to get other problems. You're going to get excision for bringing a sacrifice outside the temple, which you should never do. But in terms of your promise, you fulfilled your promise. So too, if somebody says, I'm becoming a Nazirite, but I'm going to perform the end of term rites where you shave the head and the whole thing and the sacrifices, I'm going to do that in this home outside the temple. In Gilach Sham Yatza, if you shaved over there, you fulfilled your promise, because that was your promise. It was contingent on the shaving happening over there. It's not really being a Nazirite, it's like making a promise to pain yourself, and you've pained yourself, so you did what you said you do. In the Nazirus, but it's not called a Nazirite ritual. Sin offerings and guilt offerings can only come when a sin is committed. You can't bring them voluntarily. I volunteer to bring a sin offering. You didn't do a sin, you don't bring a sin offering. Therefore, if somebody says, I take upon myself to bring a guilt offering or a sin offering, or this cow, he says, this is going to be a guilt offering or a sin offering, you've said nothing, because you can't donate a sin offering. But if a person was obligated to bring a sin offering or a guilt offering, he did a sin that obligates him to bring the sacrifice. And then he says, I want this animal to go towards my guilt offering or sin offering. Or this money is going to go towards buying my sin offering or guilt offering. Then your words are binding, and you got to do what you said, because you're already in the realm of being obligated in the sin offering, and you want to have that directed at this money or this animal. That's fine. Halacha tes. Ha'omer is an interesting law. A person says, Karban mitzayra zeh ayolda zu alai. He sees a mitzayra, a person who is healed from tsaras lesions, who has to bring a sacrifice. Or he sees a woman who gave birth, who has to bring a sacrifice. And he's feeling generous, and he says, I want to take upon myself to bring that sacrifice. So think about what's happening here. There's no obligation on the person who makes the pledge, because these are sacrifices that are reserved for life circumstances that didn't happen to him, they happened to somebody else. On the other hand, there is a realm of obligation. He didn't create it out of thin air. There's somebody who has to bring these sacrifices. And he's committing to bring it on their behalf. So the bottom line of the halacha is that it's going to be allowed to do that. You can do that. But because you're doing it in their stead, you follow their status. What does that mean? Both the mitzayra and the woman who gives birth, have the option, based on their financial means, to bring higher or lower level sacrifices. Animal, top, birds, middle, flower is at the bottom. Now usually, you must give a sacrifice according to your financial status. And if you give less, it's no good. Here, you check their financial status. If that mitzayra or that woman who gave birth was poor, maybe the person who is making the pledge, even if he's rich, he brings a poor man's sacrifice, because they're poor. But if they were rich, maybe he has to bring a rich man's offering, even if the person who promised is poor, because you're fully following their financial status. Now the beginning of this halacha is pretty controversial, because in the next book, when the Rambam deals with the sacrifices brought by a woman who gives birth and by a mitzayra, the Rambam repeats this law clearly and directly contradicts himself. He says if a person pledges on behalf of a poor mitzayra or yoldis, they have to bring, if he's rich, he has to bring a rich man's sacrifice, not a poor man's sacrifice. And the Rebbe has a long sikha where he delves into it, and maybe we'll get the full thing when we talk about that halacha. But the short of it is, the Rebbe says, where the Rambam places a halacha matters. Here, he's talking about a person making the commitment. From the person who made the commitment, from his perspective, in order for it to be considered that he fulfilled this commitment, all he has to do is check the status of the person. He's poor, I bring a poor man's sacrifice, I promise to bring their sacrifice, poor man is their sacrifice, I've done my commitment. In the next book, the Rambam is talking about how the law is from the perspective of the person who's being taken care of. The miskaper, the person that's getting atoned for. When the person is getting atoned for, the way halachically we look at it is that the person who made the pledge steps into their shoes. He takes upon himself everything which they carry. But he takes it upon himself at his level. And so if he's rich, in order to achieve the full atonement, because he's taken it upon himself, he has to bring according to his means, in this case, a rich sacrifice. So in other words, the Rambam is speaking about this law from two elements. You want to talk about whether you fulfilled your obligation. To fulfill your obligation, you have to bring a poor man's sacrifice. But to fully take on the atonement element, you have to bring a rich man's sacrifice. And again, we'll get into it in more length as we get, God willing, in a couple of months, to the end of the Rambam's 9th book, the next book. Halacha Yud, ha'omer, if somebody says, Chatasei v'elasei v'ashama yushlamav shel pleini alai. Similar concept. If somebody else has to bring a sin offering, burnt offering, guilt offering, peace offering, for whatever reason, they have to bring a sacrifice, and you want to take it upon yourself. If that guy agrees, you can let him bring it on his behalf, and you get the atonement. If he only agreed when the animal was set aside, but then when it came to be offered, he decided not to do it. He didn't want it anymore. But he retracted. But if it's a burnt offering or a peace offering, you can still bring it and achieve atonement, even if he doesn't want it anymore now, because he wanted it at the time of the setting aside. But a sin offering or a guilt offering, he's got to want it all the way through. The atonement is not achieved unless he wants it from beginning to end. Because I guess the atonement happens right then for the sin. Halacha Yud Aleph. Ha'omer, if somebody says, Harei olai kenidrei reshoyim, I take upon myself to bring the sacrifices that are associated with vows usually pronounced by wicked people. Sheminidreihen nazir v'karban u'shvua, which such vows usually include a Nazirite vow, vows to bring a sacrifice, or commitments that relate to oaths. Chayav bekulan, he's obligated to bring all of these things. What does this mean? That Rambam is kind of quoting a Mishnah. Basically, when people make a vow quickly, they don't realize always what they're taking upon themselves. They may not be able to fulfill them, and therefore, the Rambam himself brings this, the sages advised, it's not so good to always make vows. In some ways, those who make vows quickly are considered to be Rishoyim, wicked people. Out of nowhere, they'll take upon themselves to be a Nazir. And being a Nazir means you stay away from cutting your hair, drinking wine, and at the end there's a sacrifice that has to be brought. Or they'll just vow to bring sacrifices out of nowhere. I want to bring a peace offering, a burnt offering, when they don't have it, or they don't realize what it's going to take to fulfill it. Or they'll make oaths to substantiate their words when they don't have to. So this person is formulating his vow like they would. I want to bring whatever those Rishayim would have to bring if they made their vows. He has to do it, because Rishayim would make such vows. But if he says, Kenidrei ksherin, I take upon myself to bring whatever sacrifices would be committed by righteous people or upright people who make vows, leinis chayav klum, you aren't obligated in anything, because righteous, upright people don't make vows. But if he says, I want to bring, like the nedavos, like the pledges of upright people, and then that does include a Nazirite sacrifice and also another regular sacrifice. Because a nedava means that you're placing the consecration on an animal at hand. That means you know what you're taking upon yourself and you're going to fulfill it right in the moment. Therefore, even a kosher person would do that. He still wouldn't do an oath, because oath you stay away from entirely, but he might do a nazir or a karban. Therefore, if you say this formulation, you have to bring those two. V'chol kinuye karban kekarban, any terms that are used to refer to karban also are considered to be a karban. So different regions, different locales, that is different terms that they would use. Someone says, I take upon myself to bring that type of term, it means I have to bring a sacrifice. Halacha Yud Beis, a general rule concerning voluntary commitments. Ein hanoider, v'lei hamisnadiv chayav. A person who makes a voluntary commitment is never obligated ad sheyehi piv v'liba shav, until his mouth and his heart are equal. You got to say what you mean what you say. Ketzad, what does that mean? Hamiskabin leimar harei alei oila. A person means to say, I take upon myself to bring a burnt offering, but then out of his mouth comes the words v'amar shlamim. Take upon myself to bring a peace offering. Or you had the animal. You plan to say this is going to be a burnt offering. Out of your mouth comes the words, this is going to be a peace offering. Le'amar klum, you've said nothing. You have no obligation. Niskabin lindar ba'oila amar karban. If a person wanted to, or he meant to specify a sacrifice. I want to bring it as a burnt offering. And then out of his mouth comes a more general term. I want to bring it as a sacrifice. Lindar b'cherem v'amar hektish. He wanted to use a specific method of consecration called cherem, and then he says a more general consecration, hektish. Dvarav kayamim, what he said is binding. Sheha'oila karban v'hacherem hektish, because what you meant is included in what you said. A burnt offering is a sacrifice. Cherem is a form of consecration. V'chein kol kayetzivas, and the same applies to all similar situations. On the other hand, says the Rambam, when it comes to commitments, you don't have to verbally express anything. If you do verbally express, it has to match your intent. But you don't have to verbally express for the intent to take effect. If you decided in your heart and you didn't say anything with your lips, you're still obligated. Ketzad, what does that mean? If you decided in your heart that this animal is a burnt offering, or you're going to bring a burnt offering, you have to bring it. Because it says, anybody who has generous heart must bring it. That means, just with the generosity, the feeling of goodwill, the feeling of the pledge, you're obligated to bring what you promised in your heart. And the same applies to all similar consecration vows. Regular vows, just vows out of the blue, you have to say it verbally. Torah says, elsewhere, moitzas vasecha, comes out of your lips. But when it comes to hektish vows, no need for the verbal expression. Halacha Yud Gimel, echad nedarim unedavais, whether voluntary commitments related to sacrifices, im shara dvarim she'adam chayav behem, or anything else that a person obligates himself. Me'erchin v'damim u'maistres u'matnesanim, evaluation vows, monetary worth vows, tithes, gifts to the poor, mitzvahs hasemin atayra sheyavi hakel beregel shepaga b'tchila. The biblical mitzvah is to bring it all to the temple, or to give it all to whoever it belongs to, at the first holiday that comes up from the vow. There's 3 major holidays in Jewish calendar: Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. You make the vow. When is the next holiday? That's by when you have to fulfill it biblically. Shenemar, as it says, Uvasa shama v'havesem shama. Torah talks about bringing a voluntary offering. It says you have to come to where Hashem lives and bring over there your offering, which means, that means, when you come anyways, for celebrations related to holidays, bring with you whatever you committed to bring since the last time you were there. And repay all the debts that you owe to God. And therefore, if the holiday came and you didn't bring your promise, you have canceled the fulfillment of a positive commandment. If 3 full holidays passed, and you didn't bring the sacrifices you committed to bring, or you didn't pay the valuations that you promised to pay, you've now also transgressed a negative commandment. As it says, don't delay. And this is you don't transgress the negative commandment until the full cycle of the 3 holidays passes by you. No lashes for this because there's no deed. It's passive. You're not bringing it. But the point is that you have, ideally, by the first holiday which approaches, and last resort, you get 3 holidays. A person consecrates an animal to bring to the Mizbeach. Now 2 holidays pass, Pesach and Shavuot. So he's already missed the positive commandment deadline, but he still has a chance to bring it by Sukkot and fulfill the negative commandment. But then v'nafal bamum. Boom, right here, the animal gets a blemish, upda al gav behema acheres, and so he redeems it and converts it to another animal. Now, the count starts again. You don't get the transgression until 3 holidays pass on the new animal. Both men and women are subject to this law. It's a bit controversial because some say only men are, but the Rambam says here women are also. But an heir doesn't transgress. If your father or mother committed to bringing a sacrifice and they passed away, and then you have to bring the sacrifice in place of them, you're not subject to the laws of delay because it was their problem. Any holiday, any sacrifices upon which 3 holidays passed, they're not disqualified. You can still bring them, it's still kosher. Every day that passes, that you don't bring it, you transgress that law, that mitzvah. Court is commanded to force you. Take away your stuff. Your car is mine until you bring your sacrifice. Miyad, right away. Till you bring your sacrifices at the first holiday. Even if it takes force. Even though in Torah it says when it comes to sacrifices, it has to be done in goodwill. You have to agree to do it. Like we had in the laws of divorce. Also by sacrifices, the court has the authority to force him till he says, I want. And that's his true want, as the Rambam explained over there. Even though it's a want that's elicited from force, every Jew really wants to do what Hashem wants. The Yetzer Hara covers him. The Yetzer Hara forces him against his will not to do what Hashem wants. You remove the Yetzer Hara by the force, now his true will is exposed. No matter what stage he's at. He made the commitment, he didn't put aside his pledge yet, or he put aside his pledge, he didn't bring it yet. We force him till he brings it. Anybody who's obligated to bring a burnt offering or a peace offering, we can take a mashkin, take a collateral from them. Even though, again, you wouldn't get atonement until you want to bring it, it says you force him till he says, I want. But guilt offerings and sin offerings, it's a bit more tricky. You can't take a collateral. Because they anyways have to bring their sacrifice. It's essential to their atonement. We're not worried that they're going to purposely be negligent and delay their sacrifice. So we don't go to the point of taking a collateral. Except for the sin offering belonging to a Nazirite, since it's not essential to him drinking wine, so he might delay it. Therefore, that's the one exception where even for a sin offering, we would take collateral. We go to the Nazirite, take something from him to be sure that he's going to bring his sin offering.